Hello. In this unit, we will talk about the influence of policy and legislation in the implementation of Eflows. In this lecture, we will discuss two topics. First, how governance is related to the implementation of environmental flows. Then, we will continue reviewing how policy and law have influenced the assessment and implementation of environmental flows. Let's start by reviewing what is water governance. It refers to the formal and informal arrangements, practices, and processes that determine how different actors participate in the use and management of water resources. So key points, the participation of actors to be able to influence decisions. It needs to consider the existing rules and practices, the socioeconomic and institutional systems that are in place, and the mechanisms that will make decision makers accountable for the final outcomes of the decisions and their implementation. In the diagram, you can see some of the characteristics of good water governance. It needs to be participatory and inclusive, for example. It needs to be responsive to the needs of present and future generations. It needs to lead to the effective and efficient use of resources, follow the rule of law, be able to promote collaboration to achieve consensus and equitable distribution of resources, and to promote transparent and accountable mechanisms. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development published in 2015 the Principles for Water Governance. This framework is divided in three core areas: trust and engagement, efficiency, and effectiveness. Each one of them is divided in 4 principles. All of them are applicable to our topic of environmental flows. We can see that each one of these 3 areas is represented by 4 different principles, and all of them are interrelated. For example, the participation of stakeholders is essential to define the objectives for environmental flows, considering the specific needs in a river basin. This determination must be done based on a good understanding of the resulting trade-offs that people will have to accept, trade-offs between the economy and the environment. It is important that all the stakeholders participate to understand these trade-offs, and this will help make the process transparent and will reduce the possibility of conflicts. Coherence among policies is important to ensure that the objectives that different actors have agreed on are not opposed by objectives set by other policies that guide activities in other sectors. This organization specifies that the ultimate objective of systems that govern water resources is to provide enough water of good quality for human use and to maintain or improve the ecological integrity of water bodies. This is directly related to implementing environmental flows. To implement different levels of governance influence the implementation of environmental flows. In the European Union, for example, the Water Framework Directive is a policy that seeks to achieve an integrated approach for managing water resources in the territories within the Union. This is an overarching policy for all the European Union. The countries adopt the provisions in the directive and adjust their laws and regulations to make them implementable from national to local levels. One of the goals covered in the directive is to control the overextraction of water to preserve aquatic ecosystems and their services. And this is something that requires the determination of environmental flows. For that reason, the European Union has created a guidance document. This specifies how the flows should be calculated and included in river basin management plans. Although this guidance is specific to the European Union, it still has many elements that are very relevant for other countries. The Water Framework Directive specifies a catchment approach to manage water resources. And for example, alpine countries in Europe, Austria, France, Switzerland, and Italy, have adopted these regulations for environmental flows. In Austria, for example, there is an ordinance related to ecological status of surface waters. And this specifies that some of the criteria to define Eflows, it includes to have 10 years of data, and some of the hydrological requirements are the water depth, the velocity of flow, thermal conditions, and dissolved oxygen. So in this region, these authors have reviewed the specific conditions to implement environmental flows and the challenges in these different countries. As you can see in this slide, some of the challenges to implement flows, even when there is a common policy, is the difference in laws and regulations at different levels. In this case, in France, the environmental code is the one that regulates minimum flows releases, and it is enforced by the Ministry of Ecology, Sustainable Development, and Energy. However, it applies to new infrastructure, a challenge because many of the rivers have been already modified by the structure. In Italy, it is a ministerial decree, the one that regulates small hydropower plants. It will define terms and guidelines for these types of development, but it puts on regional or local authorities the role to define the specific procedures to define environmental flows. In the case of Italy, this is an important topic for the province of Brescia because this is one of the most important areas for generation of hydropower. However, also policies and regulations are not always very effective to illustrate the different trade-offs that will happen between, in this case, maintaining environmental flows and providing the energy that is required. Mexico is an example of a transition country that is just implementing environmental flows. In 2012, the Ministry of Economy enacted the Mexican standard to set the procedures to determine environmental flows in hydrological basins. This document describes four methodologies to determine flows. It does not prescribe a specific one. This document is important because it recognizes for the first time the need to maintain flows to preserve aquatic and semi-aquatic ecosystems. This document was followed in 2015 by the creation of a national program on water reserves. This is the mechanism that is being used to engage stakeholders in the definition of environmental flows and to establish the system of water reserves. So it is important to finally set the implementation of environmental flows. In 2017, the official decree that came from the president set two different environmental reserves. One was the Rio Fuerte in the state of Sinaloa, and the other the Rio San Pedro in Nayarit. This last is in a protected area, and there are other basins in the process. As you can see here, the need to set environmental flows in Mexico responds both to national needs because the country is in a semi-arid region and 70% of the country is arid or semi-arid, but also it's important because Mexico has signed different international agreements, for example, the Ramsar Convention, and there are different Ramsar sites in Mexico. So the lack of a policy for environmental flows was a barrier to make these declarations more successful. And you can see here how there are different instruments that come from a higher level to lower level that are needed to finally implement environmental flows. Incorporating e-flows in policies and legislations usually takes a long time. And there are different points that need to be considered. E-flows need to recognize the consumptive and non-consumptive uses of water, because water is valued in different ways by different sectors of the population, including some for religious and spiritual purposes. The participation of the stakeholders is very important because if they are not included, it might lead to conflicts that will obstruct the implementation of e-flows. There needs to be a clean link between the maintenance of environmental flows and the maintenance of the capacity of the ecosystems to keep providing services that benefit the population. Also, the process of assessing environmental flows needs to consider all the different parts of the water cycle, including groundwater. So it should not be limited only to the amount of water that is flowing in the river. All the assessments need to be done based on the best available science. There are different methods to assess e-flows, and some might not be feasible if there is not enough data to apply them. Sometimes one needs to start with a simple method to then gather information and continue with other one. It is very important to define what are the objectives and expected outcomes for the implementation of environmental flows at basin, but also at national level. And e-flows need to be also determined not only for river systems that are overexploited, because in that case also it's very difficult to make changes, but also for rivers that are still in good condition and in which it's possible to have a higher objectives, for example, for conservation of the natural processes and biodiversity. Once e-flows have been implemented, it's very important to have third-party audits of policy, legislation, and implementation to be sure that the objectives are being achieved and also to contribute to transparency of the implementation. So what messages can we take from this presentation? So first, the implementation of e-flows is influenced by different laws and policies from international to national level. Policy and legislation needs to be very clear because it will set the framework that will allow stakeholders participate in the decisions to implement environmental flows. And that includes defining the objectives that e-flows should achieve. Science is very important to inform the determination of flows. For example, the volumes of releases that are needed to sustain ecological processes and also meet other human needs. However, the determination of Eflows is a political process. Good governance will facilitate the use of science and information by different stakeholders and will help them understand and accept the trade-offs that Eflows will imply. Negotiations and collaboration and trust must be needed to prevent conflicts among different water users and the needs that they pursue. At this point, it is important that you think, what do you know about the legislation that relates to environmental flows in your country? Do you know how are they covered in different laws or regulations? In some cases, flows are defined by higher instruments, for example, in Mexico, a presidential decree. Do you think is this a good mechanism to set environmental flows? Could this be flexible enough in case there are changes later? For example, because of the variations in rainfall because of climate? Think about that. And here you find some key references used in this presentation.